Well, thanks very much, and I'm happy to be here and look forward to your questions. I thought I could just start briefly with where we stand. As you may all know, one of the linchpins of our trade agenda is actually winning passage from our Congress of Trade Promotion Authority, which will allow our Congress to vote yes or no on the agreements that the administration negotiates without amending them and doing it in a relatively quick time frame, a set time frame. That's why it was nicknamed fast track in previous ages. But there are two very active negotiations that are ongoing now on trade, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as the TTIP, which is our negotiation with the EU. And so those are proceeding and will continue to proceed. Just in terms of where we are on the Trade Promotion Authority, you may know that the Senate has dropped a bill. In other words, it's come out of committee and it is now going to be voted on the Senate floor. And we expect that there will be some amendments from the floor. We don't know exactly which ones or how that will turn out, but it is absolutely moving. We expect it to be on the floor and being discussed next week. And in the House, the House is on recess, so they will be coming back the week of the 11th. And Paul Ryan, who is shepherding this, Congressman Ryan, who's shepherding this through the House, has said that he wants to move the bill forward very quickly after the House comes back from its recess. But we don't have an exact date for that. And if the two bills are different, then they will have to be reconciled in a committee and then go back to be voted on. But we are very excited that this is moving forward and that we can sort of see light at the end of the tunnel, assuming that the Congress in its wisdom votes to move this forward in both the Senate and the House. In terms of the TPP itself, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, negotiations are continuing on the TPP. They have been ongoing for several years. We have moved to a place where we really have some issues still remaining. The visit of Prime Minister Abe, we were able to get even closer to resolution of our issues between the U.S. and Japan. Still have some things that need to be worked out. You may know that all of the negotiators are going to be meeting in Guam from May 14th to the 28th to see how far that they can get to resolve the outstanding differences among all the TPP countries. So things are moving ahead very rapidly there, and it shows after so many years of negotiations. On the TTIP, we're also making progress there. We had our round of negotiations just last week here in the United States, and we are set to go to Europe for the next round sometime before the summer break. The date hasn't yet been set. That negotiation is a much newer one, but we are making progress. We made progress on some of the regulatory issues in terms of talking about transparency and public participation when countries are making regulations, and in terms of discussions on what's called mutual recognition, so that if you have the same test for a product that's required in the U.S. and the EU, you wouldn't have to repeat that test again in the EU. You would just recognize that you had done it and passed it in the U.S. or vice versa. So we made some progress on those issues, and there's still everything else pretty much is open because it's a new negotiation, but progress is being made. So I will stop there and just take questions from you guys.
So guys, as always, please wait for the microphones, identify your name and your outlet before asking your question. And for our colleagues in New York, if you'd like to step up to the podium, we'll identify you in turn when it's your turn for a question. We can start here in the front.
Thank you so much. I'm Qingyi Chen with Shanghai Media Group. I believe another trade agenda that in President Obama's mind is China-US BIT. So what can we expect when President Xi meets with President Obama in the White House in September? I'm also curious why the U.S. and Japan stopped short of announcing TPP breakthrough this time.
Well, we still have some negotiations to complete with the U.S. and Japan, so that's why we didn't announce that we were finished, but we made a great deal of progress. So there was no stopping short. There was just working to get to where we got, and it was a great deal of progress. In terms of the BIT, I was focusing on the things that went underneath the congressional legislation, but the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty with China, is absolutely critical for us. We think it's a very important piece of our relationship with China. We are really doing well in the negotiations on the text of the BIT, which is all the commitments that are made about how Chinese companies will be treated in the U.S. and how U.S. companies will be treated in China. There is attached to every bilateral investment treaty a list of exceptions. Those exceptions have to do with being able to do 100% investment in certain areas. We need to exchange our lists of exceptions between ourselves and China, and that hasn't yet happened, but we're looking forward to doing that very soon. And so, these are going to be very detailed negotiations that we'll be having, particularly on the exceptions list, because we've cleared out a lot already on the text. And I expect that President Obama and President Xi will note that we're making progress towards a very high quality BIT. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but that's what we want to be doing. I don't think that we would be able to be finished with the BIT by that point in time because it is so complicated, but we expect that we'll be making really good progress. Sure.
We can move across the front, Stefan.
Frank Grober with Euronews European Television. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you don't get TPA through Congress for whatever reasons. What impact would that have on the negotiations, on the ongoing negotiations? And how confident are you that you can come to a conclusion by the time President Obama leaves office? And would it be conceivable to separate TPP and TTIP at one point to get it, to get one agreement done rather than the two in tandem?
Well, I think, hopefully we can walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of doing two negotiations. And they're at very different stages. The TPP has been ongoing for 5 or 6 years, and we're almost at the very end. TTIP has only been ongoing for a much shorter period of time. So I don't think there's any need to separate these negotiations. I mean, they're already separate. They're totally separate negotiations, but I think we can do both things and get them completed in a reasonable period of time. In terms of your first question about TPA, we are working very, very hard with the Congress in a very cooperative manner, and we are very hopeful that TPA will pass both houses. At this moment, we don't have any reason to believe that it's not going to pass, but it is the prerogative of the Congress, and it won't be easy. It's going to be, a very difficult process of moving everybody forward. But we firmly believe that having open markets and having tools to make it easier to approve agreements that are negotiated under the guidance of the Congress, and TPA puts forward very detailed negotiating objectives, very detailed requirements about keeping the Congress informed as the negotiations go forward. And we really believe that kind of partnership with the Congress is going to yield the best possible results for agreements.
But the negotiations would go on regardless of what comes.
The negotiations began without TPA, and of course they would continue.
Jennifer.
I'm Jennifer Lee with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. Two questions. First question is about the time frame. So last time when you were here, you say we should be able to see the final conclusion in spring, and now we see the spring is coming. So I wonder when we should be expecting to see the final conclusion of TPP.
Well, yes. So for that, spring, spring can go a little bit of ways. We're not finished with spring yet. And we had a late spring here, as you may know. So I still believe that, we can get the TPP concluded in the relatively recent or future. I don't know exactly when the first official day of summer is, but I think it's sometime in late June. So we're still in spring up to that point.
Okay. Second question is about China. So a couple of days ago, the President Obama had an interview with the Wall Street Journal, and about the TPP, he said, if we don't write the rules, then China will write the rules out in the region, then we will be shut out. So I wonder, is this the current strategy of the administration to make a final push domestically, either China or United States? And do you really think China's initiative will disadvantage United States?
I think that there is room for, and the president has been very clear about this, that there is room for China to have its agreements in the region as well as for us, and that we welcome China's negotiations of its agreements in the region. I think we obviously, for a very long time, have negotiated extremely high level, high commitment free trade agreements. And even in my consultations with my European colleagues, when I was personally negotiating these agreements 15 years ago, we just took different tacks. And so, obviously we wouldn't be doing it our way if we didn't think this was, the best way for us and for those that we're negotiating with. So we're going to continue to pursue that. But there is absolutely, not just one country that is involved in trade in Asia. There's lots of countries and there's lots of room for all of them. We are comfortable with a very transparent rules-based system, and that's very very strict and non-discriminatory, and that's what we're trying to negotiate in the TPP.
Brian.
Brian Beery, Washington correspondent for Europolitics. Couple of questions. You mentioned on TPA amendments may be tabled. Is there any kinds of amendments that are big no-nos for the administration in terms of, like I've heard currency manipulation, putting that in? And then secondly, on the TTIP, do you think it's fair to say that the TTIP talks are stalling at the moment? The US was very unhappy with the EU's move on GMOs. EU is very unhappy that US is just saying no financial services in TTIP. Do you think that basically the last few months have been pretty bad for TTIP?
I don't think they've been bad. I think that, if you think about we have a $1 trillion relationship. There's an awful lot to negotiate in TTIP, and things have been moving along in a number of areas, and we're always going to have rocks in the road where we don't agree. Obviously, we're very disappointed with the recent statement and proposal by the EU on GMOs, but it's a proposal. It's not in final form. It's going to take quite a while to get through the whole process in Europe. And, we are hopeful that at the end of the day, what's been proposed is not what's going to come out in final form. Because there are serious concerns about that beyond TTIP with Europe's WTO commitments. So that is we're not happy about that, but that doesn't mean that the negotiations on every other thing are somehow stalled. And as I said, we made progress, and we felt we had made substantial progress during our last round. So there's always going to be rocks in the road with a relationship this big, and where we have difficult areas that each of us has to deal with. But there's probably way more that we can plow through without huge difficulty than there are those difficult things. And I'm sorry, your other question was? No amendments. Well, we are working very, very hard as this process goes forward. Obviously, it's a prerogative of the Congress to pass its legislation. You asked specifically about currency. At this moment, there isn't anything on currency in either the Senate or the House bill. And so there is a companion bill on enforcement that in the House that has some language on currency, but the actual TPA bill does not have anything on currency in it at this moment.
We have a question back there.
Alexander Panetta from the Canadian Press News Agency. I just wanted to ask you two questions on a similar theme. The first is that there's been some chatter about maybe completing a TPP deal without Canada. I heard that from Paul Ryan, and also more recently from the administration, from Darcy Vetter, was quoted in a Canadian news report that insinuated that that was a possibility. So the first question I'd ask you is whether that's actually a real possibility at this stage. And the second question I'd ask you is about supply management in the agricultural sector. Is ending supply management an actual priority of the U.S. government's, or is it rather increased market access, more incremental change? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to prejudge the negotiations in terms of your last question. Obviously, the whole concern about supply management is market access. So I think it's sort of hard to draw lines in the sand, but the reason why we don't like supply management is because it limits market access. In terms of the question of Canada's participation in the TPP, I think, really that's something that's going to be up to Canada. All the other countries are making very strong commitments, including on agriculture. Agriculture is always difficult, and we're all going to put on the table commitments. And so I think the question is, what's the level of ambition that the Canadian government has? We would love to have Canada be part of the agreement. The agreement is going to be a very, very high quality agreement. So it's hard for me to make that judgment. I think that's a judgment the Canadian government's going to have to make.
Let's go some questions on this side.
Two questions. One is about TPP. There had been always high expectations from other 11 parties in TPP that U.S. and Japan will conclude this negotiation last year and this week, the bilateral summit. But it didn't happen. So we worry that the other 11 parties and other countries in Asia will lower the expectations of Americans rebalancing in Asia Pacific in economic terms. And second question is about TTIP. It's reported that the European Trade Commissioner, Malmström, will be in town May 4th. So what will be result in that coming meeting between Malmström and Mr. Froman? Thank you.
Sure. Well, so, we all talk to each other all of the time, and Commissioner Malmström will be here. She and U.S. Trade Representative Froman will meet. It's not an official negotiating session, with all of the negotiators, but they are going to talk about TTIP and a way forward, what we need to work on, et cetera. So that will definitely be on the agenda. We also have things that we're cooperating on with the EU, and that'll be on the agenda too. So I think, we have this huge relationship, and we can expect that that's going to be reflected in their conversations. In terms of Japan and the U.S., as I said, we made huge progress. when the Prime Minister was here and leading up to that. The fact that we didn't complete the very last, millimeter shouldn't be taken as any kind of signal that this is not on a track to move forward. And, as I said, we've scheduled another round with everybody that's going to last 2 weeks. And I think people are optimistic that these gaps can be bridged, or at least substantially bridged during that negotiating round.
Daisuke.
Thank you. Daisuke Igarashi from Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. I have 2 questions on TPP. So there was a press report that the TPP countries are planning to have a ministerial meeting in late May in the Philippines. Is that what you're planning to? And the second question is, considering the political environment in the U.S., where we're going to see a presidential election is going to fully start around summer or something. So until when do you think you need to get a TPA and also a 12-country agreement on TPP?
Well, we haven't, and there hasn't been announced any dates yet for a ministerial, but it's logical to assume that if we make a great deal of progress at the negotiating table, ministers will be the ones who will have to then sort of take the political decisions to move things, forward. And so we haven't announced any dates for that, but of course there will need to be a ministerial at the right time. In terms of timing for moving forward with TPA and TPP, we feel pretty comfortable that these are issues that can be moved forward during this year, and that we will not face a problem of our elections, which don't even occur until 2016. So we're a year and a half away from when our elections will be, and don't believe that we're in a place where we can't move forward with these things.
Any other questions? Yes, we have one here.
Hi, Gretel Johnson with German Press Agency. I think you said at the beginning, you gave a few details about the progress in TTIP, and you spoke about transparency, and I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. Because it dealt with each side respecting each other's testing in certain areas. What areas do you mean? Is it which categories, or is it across the board?
No, these are more across the board kinds of things that we've been trying to deal with. So the transparency issues are questions of, when you're making regulations, how do you make sure that everybody knows that there's something that's being proposed, and what is it in sufficient detail, and to provide opportunity for the private sector, any private actors or stakeholders to comment on those regulations, and sufficient opportunity so that they can do that and then review those comments and then sort of incorporate that into your final rulemaking. And we think this is very important for making rules about the economy in the modern world, where so much of the actors that take place are not the government. And where you need to have really detailed input so that you can make really good regulations that get to where you want to go. So that's the transparency side of things. In terms of the mutual recognition, this is really about and we already have actually in place some mutual recognition agreements, for example, in telecom for cell phones, where if you get your phone approved in the U.S. is not causing interference with the network, you don't have to retest it again for the same exact thing in Europe. So we're looking at sort of principles of that, so that not that in places where you have different standards, but where you have sort of the same, essentially the same test being performed, that you don't need to then do it twice. So just for efficiency purposes. And so that's what we're looking at. I have just been passed a note that, in fact, the TPP ministerial has been announced. So it is set for May 26th to 28th. in the Philippines. So, and you know that negotiators are meeting in Guam, so.
Do we
Not
have
that
any more questions?
Could you just explain that just a bit further on? The ministerial meeting, it'll be Secretary Kerry attending, or where's who will be at?
Will be U.S. Ambassador Froman, and then his counterparts who are the ministers involved and actually at the negotiating table.
So you just announced this ministerial meeting. So what do you plan to, what do you try to achieve at the meeting? Are you going to try to get a final deal there, or it's going to be just a check-in?
Well, as I said before, we have spent a long number of years negotiating. We believe that, we have really narrowed the differences. Negotiators are going to meet for 2 weeks in Guam to try to really take a big leap forward, and then the ministers will obviously try to see what they can do to further narrow the differences. If they can narrow them completely, then we will have an agreement, and if there's still some things that are outstanding, then we'll continue on with the negotiations.
Do we have time for one more? I see one more hand.
Just follow up on this one. So you said it's a possibility that they will have a final conclusion in the ministerial meeting, right?
I don't really want to set this up as we are calling this ministerial to have a final conclusion. It is being called. There is a long negotiation that's going to happen before that. We have spent 5-6 years negotiating this. And so we'll hope that we will make a great deal of progress. And I don't want to predict that this is the place where everything closes. But ministerials try to move things forward.